All right, this is my video on membrane physiology. My name is Savannah Pack. So we'll start off. The cell membrane protects the cell by controlling what can enter and exit the cell. It's also called the plasma membrane. Because the membrane allows things to enter and exit selectively, it makes the membrane semi-permeable. But before we continue, let's just focus in a little bit closer. So if we were to lay out a cell membrane into a straight line, it would look something like this. Cell membranes are made up of special lipid molecules called phospholipids. The most important quality of phospholipids is that they have a hydrophilic head, which means it's water loving, and a hydrophobic or water fearing tail. But we will come back to this in the next slide. So let's take a closer look at that phospholipid. So there are two important parts of a phospholipid, like mentioned before, the head and the two tails. So the head is a phosphate molecule that is attracted to water, meaning it's hydrophilic. And the two tails are made up of fatty acids or chains of carbon atoms that aren't really compatible with or repel water, hydrophobic. The cell membrane is exposed to water mixed with electrolytes and some other materials on the outside and inside of the cell. So let's just add some water. All right. So when cellular membranes form, phospholipids assemble into two layers. Because of these hydrophilic and hydrophobic properties, the phosphate heads in each layer face the aqueous or water environment on either side. And the tails hide away from the water between the layers of the heads because they are water fearing, the hydrophobic. Now, this creates that phospholipid bilayer. Now, extracellular fluid is on the outside of the cell, and intracellular fluid is on the inside of the cell. So extra outside, intra inside the cell. Now, let's take an even further look here. So, relatively small nonpolar materials can easily move through the lipid bilayer. Some examples of these are lipids and gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. But polar molecules have more difficult passing through the cell membrane because they are repelled by hydrophobic tails of the phospholipids. However, very small polar molecules such as water or ethanol are able to move slowly through by slowly passing through small gaps between phospholipids. But it's just important to know that the membrane remains fluid and the lipids and proteins in the cell membrane are not locked in place. So the cell membrane is not just phospholipids strung together, it also includes cholesterol and proteins. The cell is made up of two different types or classes of proteins. Integral proteins are nestled into the phospholipid bilayer and stick out on either end, and integral proteins are those proteins that are helpful for transporting larger molecules like glucose across the cell membrane. The other class of protein is called peripheral, which don't extend across the membrane. They can just be attached to the ends of integral proteins or not, and just help with transport or communication. Now let's look at this channel protein here. A channel protein is an example of an integral protein that selectively allows particular materials such as certain ions to pass into or out of the cell. So let's go back and discuss how substances move through the membrane, because certain molecules and ions can move through the selective cell membrane, and this defines a term used earlier, semi-permeable. So, a membrane that is semi-permeable allows only substances meeting certain criteria to pass through it unaided. So, let's go back into it. Substances move through active or passive transport. Passive transport is the movement of substances across the membrane without the expenditure of cellular energy. And in contrast, active transport is the movement of substances across membrane using energy from ATP. But let's first take a look at passive transport. All right, so passive transport is a naturally occurring phenomenon, and it does not require the cell to exert any of its energy to accomplish the movement. In passive transport, substances move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. We call this the concentration gradient. So let's define it. So a concentration gradient is the difference in concentration of substances across space. So concentration refers to the amount of one substance, a solute, dissolved in a given volume of another substance, a solvent. Now, in this picture, the solute are those red dots and the solvent are the blue dots. Now, like I mentioned, substances move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration, which is known as diffusion. So these particles are said to move down their concentration gradient. So now we will discuss the two types of diffusion, simple and facilitated. We'll first talk about simple diffusion. So in simple diffusion, a substance travels down its concentration gradient either into or out of a cell by passing directly through the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. So you see at the top, there's a high concentration of particles, and the lower, there's a low concentration of particles. And as it moves through, it is going to equal out in concentration by passive transport. So remember when I mentioned the cell membrane is fluid and allows select particles like oxygen and carbon dioxide through? So this is a form of simple diffusion. Neither of those require any energy on part of the cell, and therefore they use passive transport to move across the membrane. So now we'll look at facilitated diffusion. So in facilitated diffusion, a substance travels down its concentration gradient, either into or out of a cell by passing through a channel or a carrier protein within the cell membrane. Now, facilitated diffusion is therefore the diffusion process used for those substances that cannot cross the lipid bilayer due to either their size, charge, or polarity. And there are two types of facilitated diffusion. There's channel-mediated diffusion and carrier-mediated diffusion. So let's look at the channel-mediated first. All right, so channel proteins have openings in them that allow substances, usually water or ions, to pass through them and cross the cell membrane. They are usually selective, meaning that only certain substances can pass through them. And there are two main types of channel proteins. The first is leak channels, which are always open, and the second are gated channels, which can be opened or closed and are controlled by chemical or electrical signals. Now, carrier proteins are also selective, but they differ from channel proteins, and that's because a substance must bind to the protein, and after it binds, the protein then changes, and it'll change its shape and release the substance on the other side of the membrane. So you can see here high concentration of particles through the carrier protein to a low concentration of particles. A common example of carrier-mediated diffusion is the movement of glucose into the cell where it is used to make ATP. But let's zoom back out and look at what we know so far. So far, we have discussed passive transport, diffusion, including simple and facilitated diffusion through channel and carrier proteins, also known as channel-mediated and carrier-mediated transport. So now let's look at active transport. So active transport is the movement of molecules across a lower concentration to a higher concentration. And this goes against the concentration gradient. Active transport, active transport requires cellular energy to achieve this movement. Active transport is also achieved by carrier proteins, also called pumps, that use energy from ATP to move substances up their concentration gradient. So let's look back at the whole. So the most important thing about membranes is that they regulate what moves in and out of a cell. The membrane is selectively permeable because the substances do not cross it indiscriminately. Some molecules, such as hydrocarbons and oxygens, can cross the membrane. Many large molecules, such as glucose and other sugars, cannot. Water can pass through between the lipids, and ions like sodium cannot. Um, we'll remember that transport proteins make passage possible for molecules and ions that would not be able to pass through a plain phospholipid bilayer. So some transport proteins have a hydrophilic tunnel through them, which allows polar molecular ions to pass, and others actually bind to the molecules and move them across the membrane. Each part of the cell membrane is selective with what passes through, which makes the semi-permeable structure do its job well. And that is the end of my video on cell membrane physiology. And you'll see the sources here with links on the subject matter that was used throughout the video. Thank you all for your time.